everyone. So today's topic is on ecosystem degradation and loss. And we're just going to touch on certain aspects of this today because we're going to go more in depth with it in some of our topics next week. So it's going to be a semi-short lecture. And as we discussed in one of our previous lectures, there are 5 main threats to imperiled species. So you have habitat destruction, alien species, overexploitation, pollution, and disease. And you can see habitat destruction is really the #1 threat for all groups, and it affects 85% of our imperiled species. So this is the primary cause for the loss of biodiversity. It includes species, ecosystems, and genetic variation. And the habitat destruction that we're seeing is inevitably the result from the expansion of human populations and human activities. So there's 3 ways that humans are really dominating the global ecosystem. They are taking up the majority of the land surface, and we're using that land for our resource needs and for land use for surviving, like living, having houses, having farms, agriculture, forestry. So we've really transformed a ton of the land. And in fact, we've actually probably transformed as much as half of the Earth's ice-free land surface. And then there's the nitrogen cycle. And each year, human activities like cultivating nitrogen-fixing crops, using nitrogen fertilizers, burning fossil fuels, all of that releases nitrogen into our terrestrial systems. And it's more than is added by the natural biological and physical processes. So it's really us that's doing this. And then finally, there's the human use of fossil fuels and deforestation. And by the middle of this century, the human use of fossil fuels and cutting down forest is going to have resulted in doubling the levels of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. And it's not just, when you think of us using fossil fuels, it's not just us driving our cars around. There's a lot of other things that release carbon dioxide. Pretty much everything we do in life has a carbon footprint. Like everything we do releases carbon dioxide. Even us just breathing releases carbon dioxide. And we're going to get more into the agriculture side of this next week. And there's a lot of carbon dioxide and methane being added to the atmosphere from our agriculture. So we'll talk a bit about that next week. And some scientists went and they tried to figure out the global ecological footprint of the countries of the world. And the way they calculated that is they estimated the number of global hectares that we needed to support an average citizen of that nation. And even though the methods they use to arrive at the calculations can kind of be argued, they're a little bit controversial, the overall message is clear. When you plot against Economic Development Index of living standards, the global footprints really show that the natural resources being used by people are disproportionately used in the developed countries. So that would be our black little dots over here. These are the countries that really use the most. However, this graph doesn't show the total impacts, so there are other things that go into this, and there are developing countries with larger populations that have larger impacts than it shows here, because there's a lot more that goes into it. But it gives you a general idea. Now, when we say habitat loss, we're not just talking about the complete conversion to unsuitable habitat, which is in fact one type of habitat loss, but there's actually multiple things that we consider habitat loss. So it doesn't need to mean that the whole habitat is destroyed. The habitat can be effectively lost without actually losing the entire habitat. So there's several different types, and other than complete conversion to a unsuitable habitat, you have habitat degradation. And what that is it just changes the structure and composition of a habitat. So it makes it less suitable. It leads to reduced species coming into that new habitat. So you're not having immigration into this new area. And an example of this would be taking all the big trees that have the highest timber value out of a forest. So when you do that, you are reducing the habitat quality. There are animals that are not going to be able to live there anymore, and animals will probably choose a more suitable habitat over that one. So you're really decreasing the quality of the habitat. Another example would be a polluted lake. Lake is still there. It looks fine to the naked eye, right? But when you realize that the lake is polluted, you'll see that all of the animals will not be able to live there, all the plants will not be able to live there, and the ecosystem really has collapsed. So the habitat is degraded to the point where nothing else can survive there. Or even if it's not so severely polluted that it gets rid of everything, it's still going to cause a reduction in quality. And then we have habitat fragmentation. So what that is just breaking up the habitat into smaller pieces. And that's a very common type of habitat loss that we see. We're going to talk a lot about it today. It is everywhere. There's habitat fragmentation everywhere on Earth. Then we have habitat isolation. So what that is it's the separation of areas so populations are isolated. And this causes a reduction in gene flow. So the species are not able to go from one habitat to the other. So now they're effectively genetically isolated. And we have come up with ways to combat this a little bit. We've developed things like land bridges, which are literal bridges of land that lead from one isolated habitat to another. And the bridge itself has suitable habitat throughout the whole bridge, and it allows species to migrate back and forth between the habitats. So we've actually made literal bridges over highways that are considered land bridges because they are areas for animals to cross the highway and get from a habitat on one side of a highway to a habitat on the other side. There's also ones that are specifically designed for specific species. So there's ones that will go under the road, and there's ones that will go over the road. And sometimes they're designed, the ones under the road could be for amphibians and reptiles, maybe small mammals. And then there's ones that will go over, and those will be for the larger animals. But we don't always have both of them in one place. It's usually like either or. So we already know that habitat loss and degradation is the greatest threat to the world species, but it is followed by overexploitation in most cases. But when you look at every group of animals, so if you separate it, for example, here we just have 4 different groups. We have mammals, birds, amphibians, and gymnosperms. So a pretty diverse group. When we look at each different group, it's not always the same things that affect them. Even though they all show pretty high levels of being affected by habitat loss and degradation, they're all about 80% of their species that are threatened are affected by this. The next level isn't as clear. So mammals and birds are pretty highly affected by overexploitation, but when you look at amphibians, their next highest one would be pollution. So it's not always the same. And that's why it's important to not just focus on one of these things when we're deciding what we want to remedy. So you don't want to just focus on habitat loss and degradation and then forget about all of this other stuff. It's really a combination of things. And you need to take everything into account. We should be really trying to mitigate all of these issues. So just remember, it's not all about one thing. I know that habitat loss and degradation looks like the worst thing, but it really is a combination of other issues as well. And even though this is for a whole group, there could be certain species in there that aren't affected by habitat loss and degradation. Maybe they're only infected by disease, or they're only affected by overexploitation. So it's not all about the one. When we look at the biomes that we have on Earth, you'll realize that many of the world's major biomes have already lost a large proportion of their area. So for the most part, this blue area is their loss that they had lost by 1950. The green is the loss between 1950 and 1990. And then red is the projected loss by 2050. And this, for some of these habitats, they've already lost more than 70% of their land cover. So even other ones, the one with the least amount of loss is the temperate coniferous forests, and they've still lost 20%. It's a pretty large amount of loss when you consider how large the world is. 20% is quite a bit. And in the future, you can see it's just going to get worse. So this was a 40-year span here for the green. And then we're looking at the red as being a 60-year span. This is a lot more than the 40-year span. It's more than you would think for that amount of time. We're losing it at a higher rate now than we used to be. Now, we're going to get on to habitat and ecosystem loss. So this is the total conversion of habitat to unsuitable habitat. Okay, and there are a ton of different threats that come into this. So 98% of the land suitable for agriculture has already been converted and transformed by human activity. So we've already taken almost all the land that's suitable for agriculture. And because the world's population is going to keep increasing and we're going to have a higher standard of living, the world's farmers are going to need to increase their agricultural output. So they might need to increase it by 30 to 50% in the next 30 years. And so they're going to need the space to do this, or they're going to have to come up with some sort of way to do that with the space they have. And so it's even more important now that we're protecting our biodiversity, because we're going to be forced to compete directly against the need for new agricultural lands and the intensification of agriculture on existing lands. So even though some lands right now already have agricultural practices there, it may not be 100% lost in those areas. And in the future, if we need to increase our output, it may become 100% not suitable for animals to live. So we really need to focus on protecting our biodiversity as this is happening. Habitat disturbance has been particularly severe, especially in places like Europe, Southeastern Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Madagascar, West Africa, the coasts of South America, and of course, we can't forget about us, also Central and Eastern North America. So really a lot of the world, a lot of the developed world has had very high levels of disturbance. And in a lot of those regions, more than 50% of the natural habitats have been disturbed or removed. In fact, if you look at Europe, they only have about 15% of their land area unmodified by human activities. And in some regions it's even lower. So it's a very small amount of untouched land in Europe. And it's kind of expected that Europe would be higher because they were colonized before us. They went through a lot of their growing pains before we did. So we're on our way there. It's not to say that we're any better. We're working our way towards that. So the main threats of habitat that affect endangered species are agriculture, which affects 38% of endangered species. Commercial development, which is 35%, water projects, 30%, outdoor recreations, 27%, livestock grazing is 22%, pollution, 20%, infrastructure and roads, 17%, disruption of fire ecology is 13%, and logging is 12%. So you may not have even thought of some of these things before. A lot of these things you don't think about when you're thinking about us destroying the land, but they all play a very large role. And this is just the main threats. Of course, there are other things as well, but these are just the largest ones. So, oh my gosh. So here's an example of some different ways that forests have been destroyed for agriculture. And they all look very different. You would see this picture for A and be like, oh, well, that's obviously destroyed. But you might not realize that B and C are just as equally unhealthy. Okay, it's not that any one of these is better than the other. So in the first picture, this is where farmers have cut down trees to clear land, and they've burned some of the forest cover in preparation for planting crops. And the problem is, in a lot of these places where they do this, the land is abandoned afterwards. They stay there for a few growing seasons, but eventually the fertility of the soil decreases because it's not having all of those native plants dropping their leaves and having all of the insects and the animals that are there that are keeping the soil fertile. So the soil's fertility decreases, and then they just leave the plot and go get a new one and start over. And that's a really widespread practice. It's known as shifting cultivation. It's also called slash and burn agriculture. So they really just cut things down, burn it all, and then have a cropland for a couple of years, and then move on and do it all again somewhere new where the soil is still fertile. Then we have B right here, where some of the tropical forest has been cleared for small scale crops. So they cut down just a small area just to have some crops. And you'll note that there's a very abrupt end. So it's just straight up to the forest. There's no kind of gradual lead into it. So this was obviously all part of the forest before, and they just cut out a little chunk. And we'll talk about some of the issues with doing that and with having all of these edges of the forest exposed in a little bit in this lecture. Then there's this last picture, and you might look at that and be like, wow, it looks like trees and stuff, right? So it looks like a forest. The problem is this is not habitable for any animals, really, for there's very few species that can live in something like this. And what it is they cleared a large area of the rainforest and they use it for commercial agriculture. So this is something like a tree plantation, so maybe like an oil palm plantation. So it's really a monoculture. And what that means, a monoculture is when there is one species in a whole area. So it's one culture of species. So you really don't want to have areas like that. That makes them more susceptible to disease and invasive species coming in. It also makes it so that nothing can really survive there because anything that survived there would need to get all of its food and nutrients from this one plant. It doesn't have the diversity that a normal forest needs. So this whole area, even though it looks like it's green, is actually unusable for anyone but us. And then we have an example of our habitat loss in Brazil. Brazil and South America in general have lost quite a bit of land. And what this is there were remote sensing images from the Brazilian state of Rondônia in the Amazon River basin, and it shows how deforestation has been encroaching over just 15 years. Okay, so it was not a very long time. And the forest cover, which is in green, covered most of the land. There were really small areas, which is the pink, that's the areas that did not have forest cover. And those areas were a highway and some side roads that led throughout. So there was not that much. There was still quite a bit of forest cover. But 15 years later, it's almost all developed now. So there are a ton of roads that have been built. There's little patches of green in here, but it's really effectively pretty much gone. They've mostly cleared the roads for large cattle ranches. Now there are small farms there, and they've removed almost all of the forest cover in this area. So it's quite a bit that we are getting rid of for our agriculture, really, a lot of it. So now we talked a little bit about complete habitat loss, and it's pretty widespread. It's all over the globe. We're losing full-on habitats. But now we're going to talk a little bit about ecosystem degradation. And there's a lot of different examples of ecosystem degradation. It's not just about, like I said, just like taking timber and making it a little bit less suitable. There are a lot of different times where this has happened, and you might know some of them, you might not, but we're going to go through some examples. One big example, you might remember in 2010, there was a really large oil spill. It was the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And it kind of gained a little bit of publicity recently because they made a movie about it. But it was the largest marine oil spill in history. And it was estimated that they spilled over 210 million gallons of oil into the ocean. And this wasn't over like one day. This literally lasted for months. So there were months and months where this was just spilling into the ocean and they couldn't stop it. And for years and years afterwards, they were still trying to clean it up. So we see this type of oil spill, and it's not on land. So a lot of people, they're like, I don't care, it's not affecting me. But the problem is, it affected a ton of the ocean wildlife and just the health of the ocean in general. So we had birds, marine mammals, many other ocean animals. They all got sick, and a lot of them died. When they're covered in oil, things like birds, they're not able to fly. They're stuck in the water. Some animals have trouble swimming when they're covered in oil. So this pelican, for example, would have died if it wasn't captured and cleaned. And even after bringing animals in to help them and to clean them, you have the issue of them getting sick and dying because of the stress of the situation. You also have the issue of where to put them now. So they couldn't just clean him off and throw him right back where they got him. That whole area was filled with oil. And that might be a little bit easier to do with an animal like a bird where they can fly from quite a bit, fly somewhere else. But with animals like turtles, they live in the water. They can't go anywhere. So these, they would pull out, that's a baby sea turtle, pulled it out of the ocean, covered in oil. All of the animals that live in the ocean have nowhere to go when things like this happen. And the death didn't even end when the oil spill ended. So the deaths lasted for years because that oil was still in the water. Every year they were cleaning up the beaches. They were getting thousands of pounds of sludge coming out of the ocean because of the oil spill. So the beaches were getting covered in it. In fact, 3 years later, in 2013, it was reported that dolphins and other marine wildlife continued to die in record numbers, with infant dolphins dying 6 times the normal rate. So they were dying so much more often than they should have been. Fish were even being born with deformities, and their lifespan was being decreased. So it's not even just about the impacts that had on the environment at that moment. It's about the lasting effects that it had on the entire ecosystem. And this span of ocean was huge. This was all over in that area. It was a lot of the Gulf of Mexico that this spill happened in. So it really had a huge impact. A ton of animals had died from it, and it took years to clean this up, and it may never fully recover from this. And this is just one example. This isn't the only oil spill we've ever had. It happens to be the largest one we've ever had, but it's not the only one. Oil spills happen a lot of the time. And it's not just about oil spills, right? There's pollution going into the ocean from all different things. We have pollution from just our runoff from the land. We have a ton of trash in the ocean, and we're going to get in depth into a lot of the ocean problems in a later lecture. So then when we look at things like our arid regions in the world, worldwide, about 9 million square kilometers of our arid lands have been converted to man-made deserts. So when you go to the desert, it's not supposed to look like a barren wasteland of just sand. There are things that are supposed to be in the desert. There are animals that live in deserts. There's plants that live in the desert. It shouldn't be a barren wasteland. And the problem is a lot of our activities have kind of made our deserts functionally wastelands. They're functionally not able to support any of the native flora and fauna that natural deserts are supposed to have. So this process of desertification is the most severe in the Sahel region of Africa. And that's just south of the Sahara. And in this area, most of the native large mammal species are threatened with extinction. And it's really a human problem that's illustrated here because this region is estimated it has over 2.5 times the more people than can sustainably live in this area. So the population is so high that it's really going through a lot of issues right now. And it seems like it's just going to get even worse. It's kind of inevitable. Especially when you look at what's happening with climate change, which we're having higher temperatures, lower rainfall, and that's really adding on to the fact that we're losing our natural deserts. So you can see on the map here, these are all of our desert-like regions. Now, it's not all the same types of deserts, right? It's not all like the deserts you picture in Africa or even in the Midwest of the United States. There are cold deserts. There are ice glacier deserts. So there's quite a bit of it. But when you look at their vulnerability, you can see a lot of the areas where humans are located, they have the highest level of vulnerability right now. So we are causing quite a bit of issues with our desert biomes. And it's not just that. This is just one example. A lot of our biomes are in trouble, like we were talking about earlier. So we can also look at the coral reefs. And what's happening with them is the reefs are still there, right? They're not completely gone, but they're really being degraded. So we have all of our reefs that are closer to land. You can see they have a critical projected loss. So they're critical right now. They're going to be completely gone in 10 to 20 years. And these are a lot of our coral reefs. Like there's a lot of it that's like that. Then we have our threatened areas, and then we have a few stable areas. But you'll notice the majority of the stable areas, not all of them, are in areas where they're not next to a huge landmass. So we are losing most of the coral reefs that are near land. And we're going to talk a little bit more about coral reefs, like I said, again, next week as well. But really, unless conservation measures can be implemented, over the next 40 years, we're going to lose the majority of our coral reefs. So it's really becoming a big issue. And as you might know, coral reefs are a great habitat for a ton of species. They're beautiful places. That's why people like to go there. But the problem is we are destroying them. They're being bleached and dying. Not technically, it's not bleach, but we'll talk about it. But yeah, so we are destroying them quite a bit. So next we have pretty much our largest section that we're going to talk about today is ecosystem fragmentation and isolation. So many of our ecosystems that aren't being lost completely are subject to fragmentation and isolation. And there are quite a few species that are vulnerable to fragmentation. So you have your naturally rare species, and we talked about what makes a species rare. That was in our last lecture. And then we have our wide-ranging species, so species that have a very large range and need more space. We have our non-vagile species. So those are species that are, they have a very low ability to disperse or move to new environments. So an example of that would be like a tortoise. They cannot move very far. They don't live in a very large area. They can't go very far even in their whole lifetime. Whereas birds are highly vagile, so they can migrate sometimes thousands of miles. Then you have interior species, which are species that need undisturbed interior habitat. And what we mean by interior habitat is this is a habitat that's not affected by any of the outside factors. So not on the edge of a fragment. And we'll talk more about those outside factors in a second. So an example of that would be like a wood thrush. They need very interior forest habitats, and otherwise they won't live there. They're very particular about the type of forest habitat that they will live in. Then we have short-lived species. So they're impacted because they really die before they can adjust. So they don't even have the time to adjust to being in a fragment. Low fecundity species. So these are species that have a small amount of offspring or reproduce not very quickly. And they're impacted because they really can't rebuild their populations quickly. So if you fragment an area and a bunch of individuals die, if you can have offspring relatively quickly, then you may be able to rebuild your population and keep it going. But if a bunch of individuals die and you only have one offspring every 3 years, you're not going to be able to rebuild your population and you're more likely to go extinct. Then there's ground nesters, so birds that nest on the ground. They are at risk of a lot of things. It's a interesting strategy to nest on the ground, but they're at risk of a lot of external factors because they're just so open to the environment. So they're not able to really move into new areas as well. And then we have species dependent upon patchy habitats. So these would be species that need a certain amount of patches of habitat. And if you fragment it completely, they're not able to travel between all of this. So they're kind of isolated from one another. Now, when we talk about fragmentation, it's not just we have one effect of fragmentation. So they can't go from here to here and that's it. There's a lot of different effects that come into this. So you have the area effect. And what that is it's the reduction in area. So the fact that it is fragmented makes it less space in general. So this is a really major effect. It reduces the area of an available habitat. And there are things that can affect the area other than just whatever you built through it. So let's say you built a road through a habitat. It's not just the space of the road. There's more things that affect the area that's left of the habitat. And we're going to get into that in just a second. Then the area effects can also reduce population size. They can increase the extinction probability. So smaller areas are more likely to have a higher extinction rate. You can lose your sessile organisms, so the organisms that can't move around. And then it's especially important for large, wide-ranging species. So this is why this is an issue in a lot of our African species, the large mammals in Africa especially. When you have fragmentation, they are now confined to a smaller area, and they're a lot of the times unable to cross these barriers that make the habitat fragmented. So when you have a large species that needs such a large area, by cutting their habitat even just in half, it can make it so it's unsuitable for them. My computer likes to think that I'm talking to it, but I'm not. So then you have your crowding effects. And what that happens is your less mobile organisms and that are in your fragment, they kind of crowd together in what's left. And the problem with that is a little section of land can only hold so many individuals. And originally these individuals were spread across a whole area, but when you fragmented it, anyone that got stuck in that area is now stuck there and they can't move in and out. So temporarily it looks like, oh, population increased, but really they're all just crowded together in that area. And it leads to long-term mortality, it leads to habitat degradation, it leads to higher levels of disease with everyone being so crowded together. So it's really an issue, a large issue. Then we have the sampling effect, which is when some organisms just are affected by chance. So let's say you had a stretch of land and you had 10 individuals of one species that were all on the western side of the land, and you cut the land in half. Now, the eastern side, even though that species would range into both of them before, the eastern side no longer has that species, and the western side does. And now these species have to stay in this western side because it's separated, and now they are not uniformly distributed amongst all of the habitats. They're all stuck in one area. So you kind of changed the distribution of where species are found. So there's also the chance to lose some of these species because they have this non-uniform distribution. So let's say you had that same forest and you had the same 10 individuals, but you cut it and then you cut it into a bunch of pieces and now you have one in each spot. Now that species is going to go extinct in that area because they can't cross over, get to each other, and breed. They're going to die off. So that's just by chance you happen to do that. So they could disappear from an area because of the area that they were in happened to be lost too. So maybe the area you cut down happened to be where they were. And that's a bigger problem for like plants. You might cut through a forest or even like a grassland and happen to cut down the only individuals of a species. And that just happens to be where your fragment happened, where you cut through with your road or whatever you're doing, or if you built a little structure there. So it can happen just by accident. So that's the sampling effect. So, and then you have your isolation effect. And what that is we've kind of discussed it a little bit. Populations become isolated from one another. So depending on how fragmented your area is, if they cannot cross over, they are reproductively isolated. So it restricts the gene flow. It reduces the effective population size because now anything in one fragment is a different population than anything in the other fragment because they cannot mix together. And then finally, we have edge effects. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time on edge effects because it's something that people don't think of. When you cut a road through an area, or if you, let's say, cut just the edge of a forest off, you're losing more than what you got rid of. So the edge effects are the environmental conditions of the outside areas penetrating into the intact habitat. And that can include a lot of things. It can be wind. It can lead to invasive plants. It can be the temperature changing. It could be a decrease in the humidity. So it's a lot of different things. We're going to get into a bunch of them in just a second. So fragmentation's greatest effects aren't just due to their loss of area. It's a combination of all of these things. You lose a lot more than just a little bit of area. So when we're talking of edge effects, there are a ton of different things that can happen. So the bars here indicate how far into the forest fragment the specified edge effect would occur. So, for example, trees that are growing within 300 meters of an edge have a higher mortality rate. And the average height of trees in the forest canopy is reduced within 100 meters of the edge. So it's all things that are happening because now they're closer to the edge of a habitat. So there's increased wind disturbance almost 400 meters into the habitat from wherever the edge is. There are all these things that can happen. There's even more. This is just a few examples. So you can look through these and see the amount of examples that there can be. So an example of an edge effect and how much it can impact an area is, say you had this forest fragment right here, and when you get rid of the edge effects here, that will be the gray area, that's the edge effect. Your interior area is 64 hectares. Now let's say you build a railroad and a regular road through the habitat, and you just crisscross it like that. You might think, well, railroad and a road, they don't take up a lot of space, right? But now you're not just getting rid of the space where they are, you're increasing the areas of the forest that have an edge. So you're increasing the edge effect. Now you have all of these edges around this, and you actually, instead of just getting rid of this two little strips, you cut your interior size almost in half. So it really gets rid of a lot more than just the land by fragmenting things. And the probability of, this is another example, sighting a wood thrush in a forest that's about 0.1 hectares is only 20%. But if you have an area that's around 100 hectares, there's an 80% chance. So when you're adding up these areas, you're not looking at the entire area, not including the edge effects. You're looking at how the one little fragment. So if we went back, this is only 8.7 hectares. You wouldn't be adding all of these up and being like, oh, this is all one area. Each of these is now its own separate area. And you really need huge areas for some species. It's not about, oh, this is a tiny little bird. It only needs a tiny little bit of land. But it's about how much area the species actually needs. You need to take into account other things other than the size of the animal and adding up all the land there is. Because just because you have 34 hectares available doesn't mean that it's all one area. So there, you really only effectively have a bunch of 8.7 hectare habitats. So you really need to take into account more things, and you need to put aside larger areas than you would ever expect, especially when fragmentation makes it a bunch of whole new little areas. So another example of fragmentation that's been happening quite a bit is the forests of tropical Asia. So they've experienced massive deforestation and fragmentation in the recent decades. And when you look at this top one right here, this is Sumatra, and it's a large island of Indonesia. And it's experienced intense habitat destruction over the past 100 years. So you can see the forest made up the majority of the island. But by 2010, there's almost no forest left. And all of these tiny little fragments are really not enough to sustain most of the life that was living there. When you look at this image right here, it looks like it's a road that was cut through the rainforest to allow the construction of a gas pipeline. And you can really see how big it is because there's a person and a car in here, and they're very tiny on the picture. It's a very wide road. But again, it's not just this area that's now uninhabitable. Now you have all of the edge effects. So this forest that you're seeing probably doesn't have very many things living in it. In fact, having it open like that just makes it more exposed to other issues. So things like invasive species thrive in areas like edges. And that's because there's kind of an opening. Not many things can live in that type of area in an edge. But invasive species, the reason they're so successful is that they're able to live in these type of places. They're able to live on edges. And by them growing there, they can encroach even further into the forest and start taking over. So you're really opening up the land for more issues by creating these fragments. Then for another example, we have 2 forest maps from Southeast Asia. So this is only 20 years apart. We have 1970 to 1990, and there's a drastic decrease in the forest cover. So all of these decrease in forest cover and all these little fragments leads to all of these effects of habitat fragmentation. It's not just a loss of area. You can imagine that some of these small, teeny little fragments actually don't have any suitable land in them. They might be a fragment of forest, but it's not suitable for anything to live there. So, for example, think of if we had a small little patch of land in the middle of a town or a city, and we're like, oh, this is the park, and it's all just forest. But really, most species can't get there and live in there. You may have some squirrels, you may get some birds landing in there occasionally, but you're not going to have the diversity you would have if that was a patch of forest in an interior section. So a section that can actually support more life. Even if it's the same size, it depends on what's outside of it. Another example would be the wild reindeer herds that formerly they roamed throughout the mountainous regions of southern Norway. They had only one little break in their range, which is right here. You can see a little break. And today, their range has now been divided by roads. There's power lines, other types of infrastructure. So now instead of one big population of reindeer, they now have 23 isolated populations. So it's changed quite a bit. And you can imagine now having 23 isolated populations. They're not able to interbreed with each other. Now their genetic diversity is also going down. So it's harming not just their numbers, but it's harming their health as well. So this is a really interesting project that began to study really the effects of forest fragments. And what this is the Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments Project, or BDFFP. And it started in 1979. It's the only experimental study of the process of habitat fragmentation. And it's happening in the Amazon basin. And as one of the longest term projects evaluating the human impacts of forest fragments in the Amazon, it's kind of a cutting edge thing. And it's a model for other similar investigations. So you can look in other regions and kind of model it off of this, and we can learn a lot about fragments. So all of this started because there was a huge controversy in the conservation world. There's a lot of controversy. I feel like I mentioned controversy a lot. And it was about whether it's better to set aside one large reservoir or several small reservoirs. So should you make one giant reserve for animals or a bunch of little ones that are spread out? And that became known as the single large, several small, SLOSS debate. So the BDFFP, one of their goals was to resolve this debate. So they set up an experiment and they convinced the government to set aside certain blocks of intact habitat while they were doing logging in certain areas. And before they did any of this, they went out and they studied all the flora and fauna. They made a spreadsheet of everything that could be found there, how abundant they were, where they were found. And then the Brazilians went in and logged the area. And they set aside all of these little blocks of land. So the blocks were anywhere from 1 hectare to 1,000 hectares. So they were very different in size. And they also differed in their degrees of isolation. Some of them were very close to one another. Some of them were very far from one another. Some were near intact, large tracts of forest. Some were not. So they really varied it quite a bit. So we can look at what really comes into play here. And the area is still studied, and they're still using it today. It's still being used to look at the effects of fragmentation. It's been the largest scale and longest running study on fragmentation. So this is what their patches look like. You can see some of them are very small, some of them are very large, some are close together, some are far apart. And so because they censused the area before logging, they have been able to monitor how the forest and the species have changed in each fragment since the logging occurred. And you'll also notice some of these are near areas that they've allowed regrowth. So they have been letting the forest grow back up and become a pasture. Eventually trees will start to grow there. So they're watching it change over time as well. And researchers, what they're really trying to do is they're trying to identify the factors that lead to some taxa going extinct and other taxa not. And often these are closely related species. So they're trying to see, why are some species more susceptible to fragments than others, even though they seem like they're very similar species. And as they observed the changes in the isolated forest reserves, it became kind of apparent that there's a number of factors that come into it. So it's not just the size of the forest that was isolated that was important. There are a lot of things that are important in determining the ecological stability of the forest reserves. So there's been a lot of studies in these areas. It's not just the people working on the BDFFP project. They've allowed outside scientists to come in and do studies in these areas, but they've remained relatively untouched inside. So they are not fragmenting them anymore. Some of them they're keeping up with the edges, so some of them they're not allowing for regrowth, some they are, but inside they've been relatively untouched. And there have been a ton of studies, like I said. One of them looked at the understory birds in the fragments, and they realized that different types of birds are less likely to survive in fragments. So, for example, for insectivores, the abundance and the species richness of the most frequently captured birds declined significantly once they were isolated. And then they also found that the birds that followed the army ants species all around, so they would follow the army ants, they actually disappeared completely from almost all of the reserves. In fact, they disappeared from any reserves that were under 10 hectares, large, and they were gone within just 2 years. And these are birds. You would think they would be pretty able to switch between these areas, right? But the problem is it becomes an issue because there's an energy cost to going to these areas. And if there's not enough food in there, they're not going to waste the energy traveling across an uninhabitable land. So they're going to try to stay in areas where they don't have to travel as far. Interestingly, the nectarivores, such like the hummingbirds, they actually didn't really get affected all that much with the fragmentation. We saw like a huge decline in the insectivores and also in the frugivores, the ones that ate the fruit that were there, but not in the nectar-eating birds. So like I said, this is still ongoing. They're still collecting data. They're still trying to see how it's going to affect species long term as well, because it's really been a small amount of time in the grand scheme of things. So we have another study. A man named William Newmark looked at the mammals in the national parks in the western U.S. and also a little bit in Canada. So he looked at 229 different populations of mammals. He mostly looked at things within the order Carnivora, the carnivorous mammals, and then the order Artiodactyla, which is the even-toed ungulates, And then the order Lagomorpha, which are our rabbits, our hares, and the picus. So he tried to track the fate of all of these different species, and he looked at historical species in those areas, and then he compared them to the species that are currently present. And he was able to draw a few conclusions from this. He discovered that 29 species became locally extinct when these areas were set aside because everything else around it was built up. He also realized that 7 species were able to colonize or recolonize parks and increase the number of species there a little bit. But the problem is, you lose 29 species, you gain 7, it's still quite a bit of a reduction. So the extinction greatly exceeded the rate of colonization. Species were much more likely to go extinct than they were to colonize. He also realized the extinction rates were the lowest in the largest parks, and they were much higher in the small parks. And the survival time of a population was actually proportional to the initial size of their population. They had to have a relatively large population in order to survive for a longer amount of time, which is actually something we discussed a little bit in the last lecture. So from all of this research that people were doing, they were able to develop a species-area relationship. And this was an equilibrium theory of island biogeography, it was called. So this was done by Wilson and MacArthur in the 1960s. And really what it was is it described the relationship between the number of species and the size of the island. And this was used for oceanic islands only. And what that is those are islands that originated in the ocean and were never a part of the mainland. Continental islands, on the other hand, are islands that were once a part of the mainland, but were later isolated. So those islands have a variation of species from the mainland, whereas oceanic islands have species that had to get there by dispersing over water. So these are species that were not originally on this piece of land because the land never was attached to the mainland. So species could be added by dispersal from the mainland, and they really have found 2 factors in this. So near islands, the distance of the islands from the mainland was the factor. Near islands had a higher dispersal rate, whereas far islands had a lower dispersal rate. So it's kind of self-explanatory there as to why, if you're close to the mainland, it's easier for species to migrate to you. If you're farther from the mainland, it's harder for species to migrate to you. They have to go a farther distance. They also found that species could be lost from islands via extinction. And what mattered for that was that the small islands had a larger extinction rate, and the large islands had a lower extinction rate because they can support a larger population of species, and they're less subject to stochasticity events. So that was, remember, we talked about stochasticity last time. So really the 2 things that mattered were the distance from the mainland and the size. And that's what really determined how many species could live in the area. So the relationship of how many species could live there. So an example here, looking at the size of an island, the larger the island, the more reptile amphibian species the island has. So you can see the large islands here have way more species than the smallest islands. So you're going to find that most oceanic islands actually have no mammals. They have no land mammals, and other than bats. But the reason for that is that it's very difficult for a mammal to get from the mainland to an island. Bats obviously can fly, so they are the exception. You also have an exception of species that were brought there by people. So that's what's happening, for example, in Hawaii with the feral pigs. Those were brought there by people. Rats, feral dogs, cats, all of that. Those are all stoats as well. That's another big one. Those are all species, mammals that will live on islands, but were brought there by people. So they're not something that was able to get there on their own. But islands, typically, most of their biodiversity when it comes to animal species come from birds, insects, reptiles, and amphibians. And because those are all things that can migrate to an island easier. So, of course, birds, insects, and bats can all fly. And then you have reptiles and amphibians, which are pretty avid swimmers a lot of the time. And depending on the age of the island, there could also be species that evolved there from aquatic or semi-aquatic reptiles or amphibians. And it doesn't really encompass mammals, though, right? Because they can't get there. But either way, the number of species that you're going to see, and even though this example was reptiles and amphibians, it works with all of those species that I just discussed. The number is going to be higher the larger your area is. So they came up with this formula to determine the number of species that are in an area, that an area can have. And the formula is S equals CA to the Z. I'm not going to expect you guys to use this formula for anything, so don't worry about it. But what it really is C and Z are constants. And then S is the number of species and A is the area. So really it's determining the number of species that can be there based on the area and some constant variables that they came up with. But don't worry about figuring out how to use that formula. We're not actually going to use it. Okay, so the island biogeography model, which is what we were just discussing with near, far, or small and large, it describes the relationship between the rates of colonization and the extinction on the islands. So this graph does a pretty good job at showing kind of how it works. The blue and red lines represent how far an island is from the mainland, and the distance is what determines the rate of immigration of new species. Then you have the orange and green lines, which represent the size of the island. And the size determines how fast the extinction rate will be. So the immigration rates, the blue and red lines, on unoccupied islands are initially really high. But as species with really good dispersal habits and abilities come in, and they rapidly take advantage of the available open habitats, the immigration rate slows. And the number of species increases, the sites become occupied, and it goes down to almost nothing once the site is pretty much occupied. So it can only hold so much. The extinction rates, the green and gold curves, increase with the number of species on the island. So the more species on the island, the greater the likelihood that a species is going to go extinct, right? The more species you have, the more likely one of them is going to go extinct. The colonization rates are going to be the highest for islands near the mainland population source, since species can disperse over shorter distances more easily than they can over longer ones. And the extinction rates are the highest on small islands, where both the population sizes and the habitat diversity are pretty low. The number of species present on an island reaches equilibrium when the colonization rate equals the extinction rate. So that's these circles here. So the equilibrium number of species is greater on large islands near the mainland. So that's this one right here. Oh, sorry. Large islands near the mainland. That's this one right here. The number of species it can hold is the highest. Then when you have small islands near the mainland, that's the next highest. Still can hold a decent amount of species. Then you have your large islands far from the mainland, not much farther behind the small islands that are near the mainland. And then the ones that can hold the least amount of species are your small islands that are far from the mainland. So think of it as larger is better, right? Closer is better. So if you have both of the better things, you can hold the most species. If you have one good thing and one not so good thing, you're kind of in the middle. And for the small, far away island, they kind of have neither of the beneficial characteristics so they can hold the least amount of species. So those two categories really kind of determine how many species can be on an island. It's kind of almost that simple. But according to the island biogeography model, the number of species present in an area increases in a nonlinear way. So that is, it rises really sharply and then it levels off. So you can see that with the curve here. So the shape of the curve is going to differ from region to region, from species to different groups, but this is just a model and it gives an example of general indication how the relationship is. So this is the relationship really between habitat loss and species loss. So here, if an area of habitat is reduced by 50%, then 10% of the species in the group are expected to be lost or disappear, go extinct, whatever. But if it's reduced by 90%, which is a drastic increase in loss of habitat, you're still only going to have lost 50% of your species. So stating it another way, a system of protected areas that covers only 10% of a country could be expected to include 50% of the country's species. So it's kind of it's not a linear relationship. Then we have an example here that population studies show that large parks and protected areas in Africa, for example, contain larger populations of each species than small parks. And only the largest parks can even have any long-term viable populations of a lot of species. So each dot here represents an animal population in a park. And if the viable population size of a species is 1,000 individuals, which is this dashed line right here, parks of at least 100 hectares are going to be needed to protect even small herbivores. Parks more than 10,000 hectares are going to be needed to protect large herbivores like zebras and wildebeest. And parks of over 1 million hectares are going to be needed to protect large carnivores. So the larger the animal is, the more land they require to an extent, but it also depends on their habitat preferences. So large carnivores, that is why they are pretty much the most at risk a lot of the time, because they require so much more land in order to survive. So you can see way higher than the small herbivores. So when we're creating reserves and parks for animals to live in, we really need to realize that animals have so many needs that need to be met. And simply setting aside a patch of land that we think, oh, that's good enough, isn't enough. There's a lot more that we need to realize. We really need to do our research. We need to remember that certain animals need different things. So what happened with this is when you look at these things, there's a bunch of different rules that come into play for what makes a good reserve, a good area of land to set aside for animals. So there are a ton of different rules, and you can't encompass all of these at once. But this originally came from the island biogeography model and the species area relationship. And they saw, okay, these islands have some rules. We could use this as an implication for conservation biology. And we can use this to look at our parks and our reserves, because essentially these islands that we're creating, they really are land islands, but they're islands within unsuitable habitat. So the reserve is like a little island in a big ocean of unsuitable habitat. And a biologist named Jared Diamond, he took these ideas from these previous principles and he came up with a list of how to design your reserve to be the most effective. So he had a list of things and he came up with something that you can do, but it's worse, and then the better alternative that shouldn't be that much more difficult, but is just a better way to do things. So the first one was protecting part of an ecosystem or protecting the whole ecosystem. So you didn't need to increase this circle entirely, you just needed to expand it slightly to protect the entire ecosystem. You can have smaller reserves, but larger reserves are better. I know not all of these are necessarily feasible all the time with money issues and just land availability. Fragmented reserves are worse than unfragmented reserves. That one kind of goes like self-explanatory a little bit there. Fewer reserves are obviously worse than more reserves. So a lot of these are kind of things that are like, duh, we all kind of knew that. But they still needed to be said. Isolated reserves are worse than corridors that maintain the reserves. And isolated reserves are worse than stepping stones that facilitate movement. So you don't just have to have a land bridge. You could just make smaller reserves in between that act as a stepping stone to get from one to the other. So that's very similar here to when we're talking about island biogeography, with having near islands be better than far islands. So this is really just making these islands closer together by creating this little stepping stone. Then you have uniform habitat protected is worse than having diverse habitats. So if you have the option and it's like, okay, we can just protect this forest, or we can protect the forest, the mountains, the pond, and a little field here, even if it's the same amount of land, it's better to go with the more diverse habitat because you'll be protecting a more diverse range of species. A shape that's closer to round is better than an irregular shape. And unfortunately, that's kind of the typical one there, is most of our reserves are kind of irregular. We don't have them in very round shapes, but it's actually better to have a round shape because then you have your edge effects along the outside here are kind of more limited. You have a core that doesn't have those edge effects, whereas here the edge effects might encompass the entire reserve. Again, it's actually not better to just have large reserves. It's better to have a mixture of large and small reserves. So you want to have really diversity in everything that you have. And you don't want a bunch of reserves that are managed individually. You don't want them to be separated from one another in how they are managed and kept. So you want to have them managed regionally. So if one, you can have like one company taking control of all of these different reserves, and that way they'll be managed in a similar manner for every reserve that you have, and you'll be more likely to allow species to go between them because they're more similar to each other and than if they had been managed by different people. And then finally, this one's actually a little bit of a surprising one. It's actually better to have human integration or buffer zones rather than having humans 100% excluded. So if we allow buffer zones into these areas, it's better for the reserve. And by fully excluding humans, there's a lot of things that go into this. You're not only telling people, oh, you can't go in there, and then that leads to people going in there and doing things anyway, but you're also, by having these integrations, you're increasing awareness on these areas. You're also increasing how much people care. So people care less about areas that they can't see. If you let people go into a reserve, but you keep it managed and you keep it maintained, they're more likely to fight to keep that there because they are getting something out of it. And it's unfortunate that we have to be getting something out of something for it to matter to people, but it's the truth. if people are getting anything out of this area, they're more likely to be willing to put time and effort into keeping the area there. Okay, so that is it for this lecture. I will upload the quiz in just a moment, and that is it. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or anything.